Hey everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I have the pleasure of talking to you about how the male reproductive system is controlled hormonally. Talk a little bit about male hormones, some androgens, and we'll talk about how the whole process is regulated through negative feedback. It's very, very interesting. And let me just start off by reviewing a little bit of the reproductive system itself. So, as you may recall, these are the various structures right here, the anatomy of the male reproductive system. The primary structure is, of course, the testy. This is the primary reproductive gonad, and here in the seminiferous tubercles are where meiosis occurs, and that's where the sperm are produced. Check that out. Over 12 billion sperm per month. There's only one egg per month, so that's a lot. Up here in the epididymis is where the sperm migrate when they channel up through the seminiferous tubercles, and then they mature and they develop their ability to swim. And then when the penis becomes filled with blood during the process of erection, remember this tissue inside the penis is cavernous, and so it allows the penis to swell with blood and it becomes erect. That's when the sperm move up the vas deferens in a process called emission, if you remember that. And they move all the way up around the bladder up into this area here called the ampulla, which is sort of the swollen part of the vas deferens. And that's where it all starts to happen. This seminal vesicle, there's two of them. There's one over on the other side. They secrete this alkaline substance, which is high in fructose, that not only supplies the sperm with some nutrient, but it also keeps them alive when they enter the female body. And then that semen moves through this ejaculatorial duct, and it enters into underneath the urinary bladder where the prostate gland is. And the prostate gland is producing prostate fluid, which is also alkaline, and it also produces some substances that help the sperm swim a little faster. And then all of that semen travel out through the urethra in a process called ejaculation. And they only have a little while, 12 to 48 hours, to find and fertilize the egg. Their life is short-lived. And what's interesting is there's over 3 million sperm ejaculated, but only 200 of them will survive. So that's why you need so many of them. And then of that, only one is going to fertilize the egg. So I hope you enjoyed that review. And so check this out. Today's conversation is about how all of that is controlled and regulated, and the way in which that occurs is through hormones. And so you may recall from prior conversation that a lot of hormones are controlled and are produced in the brain. So they're regulated and produced in the brain. And one of the big thoroughfares in the brain is this gland called the hypothalamus, which sits below the thalamus, hypothalamus. And that hormone produces, that gland produces a very important hormone called gonadotropin releasing hormone. And that's going to affect this little tiny pea-shaped gland, which is really powerful, called the pituitary, and cause that to secrete some hormones. So basically, these hormones are going to affect not only sperm production for the male, but they're also going to affect secondary sexual characteristics. Testosterone, for example, can develop muscles for a man, and hair, and deepen the voice, and have a variety of other characteristics which are important that are called secondary because they don't involve sperm production. So the story kind of begins at puberty when the hypothalamus starts changing a little bit. It starts producing a little bit more gonadotropin releasing hormone, and that ultimately will turn sort of a young man into a man, and so into a functioning adult, meaning capable of producing sperm. And so as you can see here, the hypothalamus is going to be producing gonadotropin releasing hormone, and that's going to target the pituitary gland. And then in particular, where it targets, I really like this diagram. Here's the hypothalamus, and what it's doing is it's producing a hormone right here, and it's traveling in a short distance in the blood, the gonadotropin releasing hormone. It's traveling down, and it's going to the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Anterior is toward the front. And so what that's doing is that's going to trigger the pituitary gland to release gonadotropin hormones. Now, gonadotropin hormones are hormones that are going toward the gonads. So you have gonadotropin releasing hormone and gonadotropin hormones. And so that just simply, the cells of the pituitary gland make those hormones. They go into capillaries and then travel through the rest of the body. The reason they're called gonadotropin hormones is that they travel through the bloodstream, and where they're going is they're targeting the testes. And in particular, some of them target the interstitial cells, which are the cells, if you recall, which are in between the seminiferous tubercles. And some of them target the actual seminiferous tubercles themselves, the cells inside. And so here we are. This is a close-up, a light microscope of the seminiferous tubercles. This little triangle, let me highlight it here in yellow. These cells right in here, whoops, go back, the pen. These cells right here are the interstitial cells, right there. And they're sort of like in between one seminiferous tubercle and another seminiferous tubercle, if you can get the sense of that. So what are these gonadotropin hormones that the anterior pituitary gland is producing? Well, one of them is called luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone. And what's interesting about luteinizing hormone is the name itself is kind of awkward because there's a similar hormone in the female, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Luteinizing hormone is one of the hormones in a female that initiates ovulation, and thus when the follicle ruptures in the ovary, it results in this yellow glandular material inside the ovary called the corpus luteum. And so luteinizing hormone kind of has its namesake from the female, but it could also be called interstitial cell, which are these interstitial cell stimulating hormone, so ICSH. So this is kind of a cool one. This is kind of our school name, CSH. So what does it do? It promotes the development of these interstitial cells inside the testes, and in turn, these cells produce high quantities of testosterone, right there, testosterone. And testosterone is going to do a myriad of things. It's going to, one, stimulate meiosis, but it does a lot of influence on secondary sexual characteristics, testosterone does. And then you've got this follicle stimulating hormone, which is also coming from the anterior pituitary gland. Now, follicle stimulating hormone, again, that's another name that comes from the female. But nevertheless, FSH and testosterone, especially FSH, stimulates spermatogenesis. So how do you like this? This hormone coming from the brain travels all the way down, and it reacts with these cells inside the seminiferous tubercle, and it initiates meiosis. And so thus, sperm are being produced inside the seminiferous tubercle as a result of the control from follicle stimulating hormone. So more follicle stimulating hormone, more sperm production. Okay. So as I mentioned maybe before, is that all these male sex hormones are called androgens, and testosterone is the most abundant, but there's a whole bunch of them. If you ever felt like, if you had the time, type in on Google Wikipedia testosterone. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of testosterone, and it's pretty interesting. They're all sort of similar in structure. All of them are steroid hormones, which is a type of lipid. And the testosterone is secreted, it's interesting, early during fetal development in a young male. So the testosterone becomes rather high, and I won't get into it, although I could, but it's sort of triggered by this one gene, which is a real powerful gene on the Y chromosome called the SRY, the sex region on the Y chromosome gene. And it produces a lot of testosterone and basically turns the female, because we're all sort of in the first 2 months, 3 months of pregnancy, all female. And then the high level of testosterone during fetal development turns the female into the male body plan. And then it pretty much goes down and in concentration, but then it rises back up in puberty again. And once it reaches puberty, it's sort of secreted at a constant amount. And so the cells that are secreting it, again, are these interstitial cells right in here. Those are the ones that are producing testosterone. This is a really neat picture. The inside the seminiferous tubercle, and here the sperm inside the seminiferous lumen. This is where meiosis is occurring right there. Meiosis, or if you will, spermatogenesis. There's a mouthful. So what does it do? It develops these secondary sexual characteristics. So this deep voice, this body hair. It's interesting on the chest and the arms, pubic region. But in some instances, testosterone actually is associated with male pattern baldness. That's kind of curious that it grows hair in some areas and it prevents it in other areas. Thickening of the skin, building of muscles, bone, increase of the size of the larynx or Adam's apple, goes on and on. And so here you can see the transition between young man and then puberty, becomes an adult. Now, what's interesting about the regulation of hormone, if I said, for example, look over here on the y-axis, this is a picture of testosterone. This is a steroid hormone. And if I said, check this out, if I said the concentration of testosterone right there, and this is, of course, a lot of testosterone, not a lot, over time, like this. And what I said, if I were to tell you that the levels of testosterone, when they go high like this, and then they'll dip down low, and then they'll come back up, and then they'll dip down low, and they'll come back up. When something oscillates like this, and then you're able to sort of look at the average, tends to be kind of constant. When the average level of the hormone, in other words, if you were to sample the blood of a typical male, you'll get slightly different levels of testosterone, but in the end, it's pretty much constant. Now, we're going to find that that's radically different when we look at the female hormones. They go up and they go down. This is pretty constant. You're like, well, what of it? Well, it's very suggestive of a negative feedback mechanism, because when something's low, then it enables it to make more of it. When something's high, then it shuts it off. It sort of regulates itself, in other words. Negative feedback, sort of like a thermostat. And so I put this picture of this bottle of testosterone over here in the corner because sometimes I think athletes aren't aware of negative feedback. For example, if you were to take shots of testosterone, in other words, if you were to, let's do this, if you were to artificially increase your levels of testosterone, what would happen is the interstitial cells in your body would sense the high concentration of it, and they would stop making testosterone. Now, that's here nor there, because if you're taking it, but the body would certainly shut down its production of testosterone if you're taking high doses of it. And so let's talk about that a little bit. I find that that's pretty interesting. And so there's a negative feedback. So in other words, when testosterone is high, the body shuts down producing it, and when it's low, the body turns it back on. Now, how does that work? It's all about this diagram, and you can start anywhere. It looks complicated, but it's not so much. Let's start down here, down in the testes. And so this is where testosterone is produced. The interstitial cells are producing these androgens. And so testosterone is being produced, and when it's being produced, let's go here. So when testosterone is being produced, it travels in the bloodstream. And then testosterone, as you can see here, has a negative effect. In other words, it inhibits the hypothalamus. So it says, hey, hypothalamus, stop producing gonadotropin-releasing hormone. And so if the hypothalamus is not producing gonadotropin-releasing hormone, then it will not allow the pituitary gland to produce follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Let's just say that testosterone is low. If it's in low concentration, the hypothalamus is not inhibited. So let me go green for that. So the hypothalamus, this is how you produce testosterone. The hypothalamus produces gonadotropin-releasing hormone, travels in a short distance to the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. That produces the two gonadotropin hormones, follicle stimulating hormone, which promotes, if you remember this, promotes spermatogenesis, that's right, and luteinizing hormone, which is also stimulating the interstitial cell stimulating hormone, and both of those contribute to the production of testosterone. And so those go into the blood, go all the way down to the testes, and as it says here, follicle stimulating hormone stimulates meiosis. It also stimulates secretion of inhibin, which is then going to be something that will inhibit the production of testosterone when it gets too high. And then luteinizing hormone is secreted, and then that affects the production of testosterone. So these are plus, and then plus, and plus, and then that's how you get testosterone. But then when the levels are too high, you shut it down. And even high levels of LH and FSH, I find that can be kind of cool, also can inhibit the hypothalamus and can inhibit, so they regulate themselves, inhibit the pituitary gland. So that's kind of cool. That's a classic example of negative feedback in the male reproductive system. So I hope you enjoyed that brief video on the control and regulation of male hormones in the male reproductive system. Thanks for watching.